Hello and welcome back. I just recently hit rank 10 on the ladder, and so I figured that this would be a good time to go through the deck list that I've been using, kind of give my thoughts on some of the individual cards I'm using, Vanar faction as a whole, and some of the different strategies that might work for other aspiring Vanar players as well. So let's dive right in. I'm running right now 2 Aspect of the Fox. This functions as a pseudo dispel. In a pinch, you can heal a unit that is damaged, for example, a 3/1 Ghost Wolf, or get more use out of a rock pulverizer just by transforming it. When it's about to die, you're able to get in that extra 3 damage. This card has really great synergy with the Vanar card Vanar Warmaster, because you can transform any larger unit, anything with above 3 HP, and then Vanar Warmaster can trade right into it, and because of its Ghost Wolf passive, you're always going to come out ahead in these trades. You need to be careful. Sometimes if you don't have the Vanar Warmaster available, you might have to trade a smaller unit and then use your general attack to finish it off. Which does set you behind value-wise, but if it's a really large unit, then definitely you come out ahead. So that's good in a pinch, or when you need to make a really value trade with the Vanar Warmaster. But a final tip for the Aspect of the Fox is to be conservative, because these do come in handy late game, and we're only running 2 of them. These can be replaced with Frostfire for trading power, but you have to pay more for it. Frostfire does have synergy with Crystal Cloaker and other Frost minions as well, so like I said, if you don't have the Aspect of the Fox that can stand in for it, you could also run a couple of Ephemeral Shrouds where you'd still get the Dispel effect, but less reach, of course. Aspect of the Fox being a spell can hit ranged units or any units wherever you are on the map, and with the Ephemeral Shroud you're going to be able to dispel an effect, but like a hitman, you'll still need to deal with the body afterwards. Right now I'm running 3 Crystal Cloakers, and now this is a preferential pick, because not a lot of people like Crystal Cloakers because of the infiltrate effect. This deck setup that I have, however, naturally pushes towards the opponent, so infiltrate becomes a bit more consistent. And the 3 HP is nice, because it can usually take 1 attack from the general or any early minions, and then still last for a turn to get some additional value. It is a decent turn 1 play as well, because you can move forward and then play it diagonally from yourself to pressure an orb. Or, if you decide not to go for the orb on your next turn, the mana tile that is, you can just simply move it forward 2 spaces, and that activates the infiltrate. So all in all, it's not too hard to get the infiltrate bonus, especially if you're even or winning against your opponent and you have more pressure and more tempo, which again is the point of this deck, which I've labeled Value Mercenary. And so moving right along, we have 3 Hailstone Prisons. It's a great card. It's one of the strongest effects in the game for sure. It deals with really large or really expensive units, gets them right out of the way for a turn, really sets your opponent behind on tempo, especially if they play something, again, 3, 4, 5 cost, you're able to deal with it by just paying 2. The only drawback to this card is you have to watch out for units with opening gambits. You don't want to send anything back to your opponent's hand that they'll be able to resummon and get an additional use out of. This can also be used as sort of a heal. By bouncing one of your own creatures back to your hand, you'll be able to replay it at full HP, or to get extra use out of one of your own opening gambits, such as a Hearth Sister or an Emerald Rejuvenator. In a pinch, get yourself some extra healing. So that is a couple different uses for it. It's overall just a great card for dealing with any sort of pressure from the opponent. And a nice bonus about Hailstone Prison is if your opponent's hand is full, the card that you send back will actually completely disappear. So it's actually a 2-cost hard removal in some situations, which is nice, especially if you're going against your opponent who's playing a control deck. So that is a plus. We're also running 2 Healing Mystics. You could easily run 3 of these, especially if you don't like Crystal Cloakers. You could cut out a Crystal Cloaker to run a Healing Mystic instead. I just prefer Cloakers again because they have a bit more damage potential, and Healing Mystics aren't as good for a turn 1 play because you're missing out on that heal. I really appreciate the heal for topping off my general late game or early game if you have to make a trade against something that you've transformed with Aspect of the Fox, or to top off a Fenrir Warmaster to get even more value and use out of it. So that's always a plus. With the 3 HP, it has the same strength as the Crystal Cloaker in that aspect, where it's usually able to take 2 hits or so. And being able to heal your Rock Pulverizer as well, keeping your opponent locked down in place, is another great way this deck generates value. Moving right along, we do have the Hearth Sister. I'm running 3 of these. A lot of people, especially me, were kind of sleeping on these. Didn't really think that it was a great card, a 3-2, but the opening gambit to switch positions with any other minion is extremely useful. It's like your utility bread and butter. It can function as a sort of like a repulsor beast, moving a unit away from your general or out of the way. If something's blocking the enemy general that you need to get closer, you can use the Hearth Sister to swap them out of the way and close in to continue pressuring the opponent. So it's a great card. You can also use it to deal with ranged units, which is really huge. It gives you a lot of reach and global pressure on the map. It also facilitates the Arctic Displacer finisher, which we will talk about in a little bit. And one other use for Hearth Sister that I'd like to talk about is when you summon it and switch places with a minion, it counts as being summoned in the spot that it switched to. So you have to be careful with Hearth Sister if you're going to be using it to try to capture mana tiles. You have to swap one of your own creatures onto that mana tile space in order for it to count. If you swap with an enemy minion, your opponent's going to get that mana. They won't be able to use it, but it'll still go to waste. So that's how you use Hearth Sister to secure that tile for yourself, or you could use it in the other way if you wanted to deny a mana tile to your opponent. And again, 3 damage is great just for trading in general, or for buffing it and really sneaking that damage in. All in all, a superb card. Always run 3 of these if you can. If you don't have 3, again, switch in maybe Healing Mystics or whatever else you think can fit in that 2 spot. Maybe even Piercing Mantis. Just something to get you a nice 2-drop instead, but get 3 of these as soon as you can, and you'll notice some definite improvements for your Vanar deck. Moving to the next slot here, we have Mark of Solitude. And this, again, is another card that people weren't really sure about, but once you actually start playing it, it is extremely useful. Oh, hang on, I accidentally took one out there. I want 3 of those. It turns a minion of your choice into a 5/5, and that minion can no longer attack generals. And now, turning something into a 5/5 is extremely useful. You can use it on a wounded minion, so it's a buff and a heal, so you can get even more value out of a Rock Pulverizer. You can keep your opponent locked in place, then you can trade with whatever minions they send out to try to, keep the pressure off. Or if they're really desperate, your opponent will have to destroy the Rock Pulverizer with their general in order to create distance or prevent being locked down in one spot for usually about 2 turns with the Rock with the Rock Pulverizer. And so they're taking 5 damage. It's a great value card. And one other thing to point out is the 5/5 buff is a transformation effect. So the stat change cannot be dispelled, However, the additional ability of not being able to attack generals can be. So that does have some synergy with maybe ephemeral shrouds and things like that, or if your opponent has to play a Sunbloom or a Lightbender or something to get away from the provoke, they then enable your 5/5 unit to attack generals, which is very useful, especially if you cast this on a Veil Hunter or something. Having a 5/5 ranged unit, even if you're not able to attack the general, you have a unit on the other side of the board that's just basically taking out whatever creatures your opponent's summoning all the way up through early and mid game. So that is a huge plus, definitely a good card. The another thing with the Mark of Solitude is it can be cast on enemy units, which I don't recommend. It can be used in a pinch if it's a really big unit that has, you know, more than 5 attack or more than 5 health. You're sort of debuffing it, and since it can't attack your general, you know, you're kind of safe there, but you're going to end up having to trade a couple of your own minions into it to kind of even things out. So, sort of good to get out of a pinch, but not recommended. But just something to think about. And again, already mentioned, Rock Pulverizer is fantastic. It's a 1/4 with Provoke, super cheap, great for locking your opponent down so that they can't get mana tiles, keeping pressure off of your general. It's great for buffing so that you're able to just keep your opponent in that one spot. The point of Vanar and this deck in general is to push over onto the opponent's side of the field so you're able to get your infiltrate bonuses, etc., etc. Great card. Run 3 of these. It's a basic card, so just put them right in and just play them well. It's a great turn 1, and again, just A+ creature. Right here, already mentioned, Veil Hunters, running 3 of those. It's a great turn 1 drop because you're just going to be constantly hitting your opponent's creatures or the general with 1 damage from a range, and it has great synergy with Mark of Solitude. One play that I have heard of with the Veil Hunter is if you happen to get it in your opening hand with a Mark of Solitude, don't be afraid to move forward and play it diagonally as though it were a Healing Mystic or a Rock Pulverizer or a Crystal Cloaker. That way you're still able to use it to capture a mana tile and then transform it into a 5/5. Even if it does end up taking a hit in melee range, it's still going to be left with, you know, 4 or 3 HP to function, and then it can just move back and keep hitting from a range. So that is another play possibly with the Veil Hunter, and they do fall off sort of late game, but we're running 3 of them here just so we have the higher chance of getting it in our starting hand. It's definitely good turns 1, 2, and 3 where you can play it in a safer spot and really establish board control and tempo on the opponent. And so continuing, we do have the Fenrir Warmaster. I mentioned these briefly, running 3 of these. This is core for pretty much all Vanar decks. Having a 3/3 for 3 that when it dies summons an additional one. Your opponent essentially has to kill this unit twice. It becomes very sticky, generates a lot of value, trades with a lot of things, synergizes with all of this deck's buffs, and it also is a Dispel Magnet. The most efficient way to deal with Fenrir Warmaster is to dispel it and then kill it, and so that's going to eat up your opponent's Dispel answers, so you're able to keep pressure on them for later. So again, this is just a great card. Run 3 of them, great damage, great stickiness, overall fantastic unit. And right now in this deck, I'm running 1 Lady Lock. If I did a bit more research, I might be able to cut something and run 2. Normally, this does synergize with your wall cards, generating a lot of small walls with Provoke and additional stats. There are no wall cards in this deck, but Lady Lock is still a great solid unit. Has some additional Provoke for lockdown. Playing Lady Lock on turn 7 generates a lot of value with Razorback. You play Lady Lock and then Razorback. Razorback buffs Lady Lock buffs the Razorback and gives it Provoke, and so you have 2 fantastic units locking down your opponent, dropping the damage on them. It's a great play. Lady Lock, if you hold on to it for mid-late game, you get the most value out of it. You're able to summon it, maybe even pull a Veil Hunter and a Rock Pulverizer on top of it, and so then all of a sudden you have a 2-4, a 2-3, excuse me, Veil Hunter hitting them from a good range, and that's definitely a plus for the tempo and overall theme of this deck. Right now we're also running 2 Saber Spine Tigers. The 3 damage with Rush is great when you need to deal with something right away, you don't have much other answers, or for, you know, reaching maybe across the map to get at a ranged unit. It trades perfectly into Aspect of the Fox, so it's a great way for dealing with those pesky units as well if it's something larger. You can get extra value out of Saber Spine Tiger if you attack something with 1 health. For example, you move forward with your general, attack the opponent's Rock Pulverizer per se, then use your Saber Spine Tiger to take it out. It still remains on the board and gets additional value. Also good for taking out obelisks and things like that. And since it does its damage and essentially disappears, the 2 HP makes it trade into pretty much everything. It functions more like a spell, really, and since it is sort of situational in that regard, we are only using 2 of them, because generally Saber Spine Tiger is considered a minus tempo play. In order to shore up the damage of this deck, we're running 2 Snowpiercers. Same reason for Saber Spine Tiger, it is a bit situational, so we're only running 2 of them, because if you're taking a lot of damage with your general and you're low on HP, you aren't going to want to go into attack range with your general. So later game, if you're falling behind, it is a bit risky to go in with the Snowpiercer, but it's still a great card despite being named after a bad movie. It puts huge pressure on the opponent, sort of like Adamantite Claws, and forces them back. That's the whole thing with this Value Mercenary deck. You just want to keep pushing your opponent back. Hopefully they'll corner themselves. It's great for dealing with large minions in a pinch if you really have to. Normally, if you're dropping a Snowpiercer on yourself to take out a creature, it's something in the neighborhood of 4 attack or more, so you have to be somewhat ahead or willing to take that risk to take the damage onto your general. And Snowpiercer pretty much hard counters Primus Shieldmaster, which is a big provoke unit. Not a lot of people run it, of course, but taking the 2 damage to the face in order to just get rid of that provoke is usually a really big play on your part. The main point of Snowpiercers is to drop as many charges as you can onto the enemy general. And if you happen to stack both of them, the 10 damage is huge, and you can easily use it to close out games. I've had games with this deck where I'll equip a Snowpiercer turn 3, attack the enemy general, and then they drop like a provoke unit or something to block me. I'll just get it out of the way with Hailstone Prison and hit them again with the Snowpiercer, or, you know, even equip a second Snowpiercer and go right in, and you're just doing huge damage. It's a very big tempo play, especially early mid, or taking out those big creatures, but falls off later if you're low on HP. Which brings us to our next point, the Emerald Rejuvenator. Its opening gambit is to restore 4 health to your general, so that actually makes Snowpiercer a bit more viable, since you're going to be able to kind of go into melee range more, and take those hits and tank that damage. Vanar as a faction suffers from lack of healing, so you're going to have to bring in these neutral creatures like Emerald Rejuvenator and Healing Mystic to kind of keep up your general's health, especially since this is a aggressive tempo-based deck. You're going to be tanking a lot, going right into the enemy general. And Emerald Rejuvenator as a 4/4 is kind of decent. It'll be able to take a couple hits, take out most things with the 4 damage, synergizes with all of our buffs well. If you drop Emerald Rejuvenator and a Razorback, having a 6/4 is huge. Definitely a great card for later in the game, especially when this deck and Vanar in general start to run out of steam. Well, I won't say Vanar in general. This deck specifically runs out of steam late into the game. So if you're getting kited around a lot, or you can't really quite get the advantage on your opponent, you start to run low, Emerald Rejuvenator is a perfect addition to this deck to kind of keep yourself going. If you don't have Emerald Rejuvenators, because these are rare cards, I would suggest swapping them in with Hailstone Golems instead. You get sort of the same value. I actually had to craft these two Emerald Rejuvenators. I was unlucky and didn't get any in the packs I opened, so I had to create these. I had to craft them just specifically for this deck to keep it going, and they've always proven valuable and useful for me, so definitely recommend just the two of them. If you, based on your preference, if you're able to cut some things out, maybe put in 3, but the 2 right now is working great for me. Razorback, the 4/3, opening gambit, give your non-wall minions +2 attack. Razorbacks are one of the strongest cards in the game, definitely like top 3 Vanar faction cards right now. Its effect doesn't work on wall minions, which is also one of the reasons we aren't running any wall cards, but it just generates such positive value. Even if you can only buff one other minion with it, it's worth it. The buff is permanent, and so you're able to use the Razorback for big damage, finishing off games, and for making favorable minion trades. So that's always a plus. And just remember to summon it last, to think out your turn, count your mana before you summon anything to make sure you're getting maximum value out of the Razorback. Make sure you're replacing if you need to replace first to see if maybe you draw an additional 2-drop that you can buff with the Razorback as well. If you don't have 3 of these, definitely put in Hailstone Golems or Bright Moss Golems for bulkiness and value. You could maybe even swap in a Silhouette Tracer, since it can let you gap close with your Snowpiercer a little bit easier, and that kind of makes up for the lack of damage. These Razorbacks, I think I only had to craft 1. I got 2 out of packs, which is very lucky since these are rare. So definitely work with those other cards until you get your Razorbacks. 3 of them for sure. And so getting into these last few cards in the deck, these are sort of situational, just sort of party favors thrown in to really help us in the late game. Once this deck starts to run out of steam, in your opponent summoning more creatures or bigger creatures, you're going to have sometimes here and there difficulty closing out those games. So Spirit of the Wild reactivates friendly minions on your opponent's starting side of the battlefield. You're most likely going to be pushed onto the opponent's side of the field with this deck, with this pressure that you're exerting onto them. So Spirit of the Wild is great for Arctic Displacer. If you played on 9 mana, you play Arctic Displacer, Spirit of the Wild, get that 10 damage in order to finish off your opponent. It's also good on 8 mana, summon like a Razorback, Spirit of the Wild. Razorback gets to attack on the turn it was summoned, plus any other minions that you've buffed. Overall, it's basically an attack twice and finish off the opponent. This is like your big card. I did happen to get one of these from a pack. It is a rare card, so, well, I mean, it's a legendary card, so if you don't have it, then don't sweat it. I mean, excuse me, I think the purple is epic rarity. So if you don't have it, don't sweat it. It's just kind of there to help with the ultra late game. And the deck, because it is situational, your deck needs to be consistent without this card. So this deck does perform well without Spirit of the Wild. This is just there as an extra insurance policy. There is going to be the random game where you don't have advantage on your opponent and they manage to somehow get past you, or Silhouette Tracer, etc., and get onto your starting side of the field, making the Spirit of the Wild useless. So again, it's just there as icing on the cake. You don't need it, essentially. Arctic Displacer, just briefly mentioned, great with Spirit of the Wild for finishing the opponent. Since it has airdrop, you can actually drop it on the other side of the field, up in a corner somewhere away from the action, and then swap it in with Hearth Sister to bring it in and attack the enemy general. That 10 damage is huge. I've had a couple of games where I was able to simply place it next to the enemy general, and they didn't have anything to deal with that 4 HP, especially if with the value this deck generates, your opponent is losing out on card advantage, only has like 1 or 2 options in their hand. You can feel safer dropping this down. Right next to them, if it's later in the game, you can go Arctic Displacer, maybe Lady Locke Arctic Displacer, so it gets that extra HP. Always a great finishing card for Vanar. A lot of usefulness there with the 10 damage. One other thing that's overlooked with this deck, but you could take advantage of, is Arctic Displacer is a Frost minion, so it does synergize with Frostfire. You could, if it's later in the game, you have 8 mana, you can buff it, and it'll get up to 13/7, which is enormous. So that is overall good card. Again, this is just there to help close out games, if need be, really late in the game. I also have Dancing Blades. It's actually really good to play right at 5 mana if you can get the opening gambit to trigger. Dealing the 3 damage to any minion in front of it is actually a bit hard to set up. It only affects that one tile. Sometimes your opponent plays around it. Most of the time it's by accident, or your general is just in a bad position and can't get around to summon it on the right space, which is unfortunate. It is very situational. This is pretty much a placeholder until I get a Frosthorn Rhino, which will have better synergy with Hearth Sister and Spirit of the Wild. So definitely good to run this for now until you get something better. And finally, we have Aspect of the Mountains. This is an AoE spell which Vanar is lacking. It's great for getting back your board control or keeping up the pressure during the late game. Having a 5/5 body isn't too bad either. 5/5 for 6 that deals 5 damage to everything around it. It's sort of like a frenzy, which is kind of good. Casting it on a friendly minion that's not already on the board would require 7 mana. Like you summon a rock pulverizer and then transform it in order to clear your enemy's minions. So this is definitely a late game only card, especially if you're losing. You have that empty board. You're going to have to play it at, pardon me, 8 mana to summon the 2-drop and then transform with Aspect of the Mountains. You can cast it on enemy minions and the AoE damage still activates, but after you do that, you're still going to have to deal with a 5/5 afterwards. If you're in a situation where you're desperate enough to take out your opponent's minions and give them a 5/5, then dealing with that creature is probably going to be tough for you anyway. So it's definitely a toss-up. I actually was in that position once where I had to give my opponent the Seismic Elemental in order to clear out the rest of their creatures, and dealing with that afterwards was actually very difficult, because you'll need to have like a couple Fenrir Warmasters available, or you can take it out with the Snowpiercer if you want to take that 5 damage. So it's definitely a toss-up. All in all, very good for keeping the pressure up late game when this deck runs out of steam. And so that's it for the whole deck. Value Mercenary. All in all, I feel it is really decent. You can make some tweaks here and there depending on whether or not you hate Crystal Cloakers, how much you like Healing Mystics and Saber Spine Tigers, things like that. You could probably cut a couple cards to make room for Ephemeral Shrouds, Aspect of the Fox, but right now, this right here definitely is a good balance for me. And I don't have any specific win rate numbers or anything like that, but again, I did get to rank 10 recently as the time of this recording. So there's some room for some really creative plays with this deck, with Hearth Sister and the like. So you'll have a lot of fun just playing Vanar and outthinking your opponent, doing a lot of damage, and just keeping the aggressive plays on. So if you like aggressive decks, it's not something that's too mindless, something you can think and really have your creativity show through, this is a really great setup. And so that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for listening to my huge rant in this video. I'm going to be uploading some more gameplay footage here pretty soon. And please leave a comment, your thoughts on this card, what you think of Vanar as a whole. And I'll see you next time. Have a good one.